Joseph Stalin, born Iosif Vissarionovich Dzugashvili on December 18, 1878, in the small town of Gori, Georgia, came from extremely humble beginnings. His father, Vissarion Dzugashvili, was an abusive alcoholic who worked as a cobbler, while his mother, Ekaterina, supported the family by working as a washerwoman. Despite these hardships, Stalin's early life was characterized by his deep desire for education and intellectual development. However, his physical condition, smallpox scars on his face, resulted in a difficult social experience. He was frequently bullied by peers, which led to feelings of isolation and a longing to escape his bleak circumstances. Stalin's introduction to revolutionary ideas came during his youth. He became politically active while studying at the Tiflis Spiritual Seminary, where his involvement in Marxist-Leninist groups put him at odds with the authorities. His expulsion from the seminary for his radical activities marked a turning point, as he fully committed himself to the revolutionary cause. After his expulsion, Stalin engaged in underground revolutionary work, joining the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party and later the Bolshevik faction, led by Vladimir Lenin. His early experiences of hardship, injustice, and social exclusion laid the foundation for his authoritarian approach to leadership. These early years shaped his worldview, instilling a belief that only through centralized power and ruthless control could the Soviet Union achieve its revolutionary goals. Joseph Stalin's rise to power was a complex and calculated process marked by manipulation, ruthless elimination of rivals, and the consolidation of authority. After the October Revolution of 1917 and the subsequent establishment of the Soviet government, Stalin quickly climbed the ranks within the Bolshevik Party, largely due to his organizational skills and loyalty to the party's leadership. However, his path to leadership was far from straightforward. Stalin's political ascent began during Lenin's leadership, but his methods contrasted sharply with those of his more moderate contemporaries. He quickly recognized the need to assert dominance within the party and worked tirelessly to remove rivals who posed threats to his position. After Lenin's death in 1924, a power struggle ensued between several key figures, including Leon Trotsky, Grigory Zinoviev, and Lev Kamenev. Stalin, leveraging a carefully constructed image of a loyal, steady, and reliable bureaucrat, positioned himself as the moderate, bridging different factions of the party. This allowed him to maneuver through alliances and backroom deals to weaken his opponents gradually. Stalin's key advantage lay in his control of the party apparatus, particularly the position of general secretary, which enabled him to shape the party's composition and manipulate appointments. He used his control over the appointments to place loyalists in key positions, ensuring unwavering support for his rise. Furthermore, Stalin skillfully employed propaganda to portray himself as the sole successor to Lenin, positioning his rivals as reckless or overly ideological. By the late 1920s, Stalin had effectively consolidated power, eliminating key rivals and transforming the Communist Party into a one-party dictatorship. His ruthless tactics, including purges and intimidation, ensured that his leadership went unchallenged, cementing his position as the undisputed leader of the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin's leadership of the Soviet Union was marked by the establishment of a totalitarian regime that exerted absolute control over every aspect of society. Upon consolidating power after eliminating his political rivals, Stalin imposed a centralized and authoritarian form of governance that left little room for dissent or opposition. His rule was characterized by strict state control over the economy, media, culture, and even personal freedoms. Stalin's approach to governance revolved around the ideology of Marxism-Leninism, which he interpreted as requiring a strong, centralized authority to guide the proletarian revolution. His concept of socialism was rooted in the belief that the Soviet state needed to rapidly industrialize and modernize the nation through rigorous policies that prioritized the state over individual rights. Stalin viewed dissent as a threat to the stability of the socialist state, and opposition to his policies was met with swift and brutal suppression. The hallmark of Stalin's dictatorship was the use of purges to eliminate perceived enemies within the Communist Party and Soviet institutions. Between 1936 and 1938, Stalin oversaw the Great Purge, which resulted in the arrest, execution, or imprisonment of millions of Soviet citizens. The Purge targeted political rivals, intellectuals, military leaders, ethnic minorities, and anyone deemed a threat to his authority. Confessions were often extracted through torture or forced confessions, and show trials were staged to legitimize Stalin's control. Furthermore, Stalin relied on the secret police, the NKVD, People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, to maintain a climate of fear. The NKVD operated extensive networks of surveillance, informing, and repression that extended deep into the Soviet Union's population. This extensive use of coercion ensured that Stalin's rule was unchallenged, as the threat of arrest, imprisonment, or execution kept opposition to a minimum. In addition to suppressing dissent, Stalin transformed Soviet institutions into tools of state propaganda. The media, schools, art, and even science were harnessed to promote a glorified image of Stalin as the infallible leader and architect of the Soviet Union's greatness. History was rewritten to align with his vision, and any deviation from the official narrative was deemed heretical. Under Stalin's dictatorship, the Soviet Union became a state where ideological conformity was mandatory, and any expression of independent thought was met with repression. His reign thus left an indelible mark on Soviet society, characterized by fear, repression, and an unprecedented concentration of power. Joseph Stalin's ambitious economic policies were driven by the need to rapidly industrialize the Soviet Union and transform it into a global superpower. To achieve this goal, Stalin implemented a series of 5-year plans starting in 1928, which dictated every aspect of economic life: production, labor, and resource allocation. These plans were central to his vision of creating a modern, socialist state, but they came at a significant human cost. The first 5-year plan, launched in 1928, focused on heavy industry, such as coal, steel, iron, and machinery production. The plan sought to increase industrial output by employing a combination of forced labor, urbanization, and technological advancements. Rural communities were collectivized, with millions of peasants forced to work on state-run farms, while industrial projects like massive factories, power plants, and infrastructure were rapidly developed. However, these ambitious targets led to significant mismanagement and inefficiencies. Factory quotas were set unrealistically high, and workers and managers were subjected to harsh penalties for failing to meet them. As a result, there was widespread falsification of production data, with officials providing inflated numbers to avoid punishment. This distorted the true state of industrial output, leading to resource shortages and poor quality goods. One of the most devastating consequences of the 5-year plans was the use of forced labor. The Soviet regime relied heavily on gulags, labor camps where political prisoners, criminals, and ordinary citizens deemed undesirable were sent to work in harsh, inhumane conditions. These forced laborers worked on major infrastructure projects such as the White Sea-Baltic Canal, the construction of railways, and other large-scale industrial ventures. Thousands of workers perished due to poor working conditions, malnutrition, and exhaustion. Additionally, the policies of forced collectivization had a profound impact on agriculture. Millions of peasants were coerced into collective farms, where their private plots and livestock were confiscated. The idea was to create a more efficient and modern agricultural system, but this led to devastating consequences. The collectivization process caused widespread famine, including the Holodomor in Ukraine, where millions of Ukrainians starved to death between 1932 and 1933. The grain produced was confiscated by the state for export, while millions went without sufficient food. Despite these failures, Stalin's vision was to demonstrate the Soviet Union's dominance through rapid industrial progress. By the time of the Second World War, Soviet industry had achieved significant growth, supplying the Red Army with the necessary resources for the war effort. However, the costs of these achievements were immense: human suffering, mass repression, and environmental devastation. The 5-year plans were instrumental in transforming the Soviet Union into an industrial powerhouse, but they came with a deep cost to the population and society as a whole. The Great Purge, a period of intense political repression and mass executions, is one of the most infamous events during Joseph Stalin's reign. Initiated in the late 1930s, The purge was designed to eliminate any perceived threats to Stalin's power, including political rivals, intellectuals, military leaders, ethnic minorities, and even ordinary citizens who were deemed disloyal or suspicious. Stalin's paranoia about betrayal and opposition grew following the consolidation of his power, and he believed that any dissent could lead to the collapse of the Soviet state. As a result, he implemented a ruthless campaign to root out those he saw as enemies of the revolution and socialism. The purge involved show trials, secret police investigations, and mass executions, resulting in millions of arrests and deaths. One of the most prominent aspects of the Great Purge was the use of the NKVD, People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, which operated extensively to arrest and interrogate individuals on fabricated charges. Entire families were often targeted, and confessions were often extracted through torture, psychological manipulation, and intimidation. Trials were held where individuals were forced to confess to crimes they did not commit, often confessing to anti-Soviet conspiracies, espionage, or sabotage. Key figures within the Communist Party were the first to be purged. Many high-ranking officials, such as former allies of Stalin like Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Bukharin, were accused of plotting to overthrow the government and were subsequently executed or sent to the gulag. These purges extended beyond party leaders to include military officers, scholars, artists, and even ordinary citizens who could not meet the expectations of Soviet ideology or who voiced opinions contrary to Stalin's policies. In addition to purging political opponents, the Great Purge targeted ethnic minorities who Stalin perceived as potential threats to Soviet unity. This included mass deportations of entire ethnic groups, such as the deportation of Chechens, Crimean Tatars, and other groups deemed disloyal to the Soviet regime. This further contributed to the climate of fear and oppression, as millions of innocent people were persecuted for their perceived associations or allegiances. The purge reached its peak between 1936 and 1938, with millions of people executed or sent to labor camps. Estimates vary, but it is believed that the total number of victims could be in the millions. The purge not only eliminated those who opposed Stalin, but also created an environment of terror where suspicion and denunciation became commonplace. Neighbors, colleagues, and even family members were encouraged to report on each other, leading to a society gripped by paranoia and mistrust. Ultimately, the Great Purge served to consolidate Stalin's power, leaving the Soviet Union under a regime of complete dictatorship. The purge is remembered for its extreme brutality and for creating a culture of fear that lasted long after Stalin's death. It stands as a stark reminder of the dangers of totalitarianism and the abuse of power. Joseph Stalin's rule was characterized by the establishment of a totalitarian regime where every aspect of Soviet life was controlled and dictated by the state. From the economy to education, media, and culture, Stalin imposed a centralized system that left little room for individual autonomy or dissent. This totalitarian structure ensured that the Soviet Union became a society of absolute conformity, where the state was above all else, and any deviation from official ideology was met with harsh punishment. At the heart of Stalin's totalitarian rule was his belief that a strong, centralized government was necessary to guide the Soviet Union through its socialist transformation. The Communist Party was elevated to the highest authority, and all other institutions were subordinated to it. Through a combination of propaganda, secret police, censorship, and forced labor, Stalin maintained absolute control over the Soviet Union. One of the most significant tools of Stalin's totalitarian regime was propaganda. The Soviet government created an idealized image of Stalin as the father of the nation, an infallible leader whose wisdom and vision were the driving forces behind Soviet success. Media, art, literature, and education were carefully monitored to ensure that only state-sanctioned messages were disseminated. Schools taught children to revere Stalin, while universities were purged of intellectual dissenters who challenged official party doctrine. The secret police, NKVD, played a crucial role in maintaining Stalin's totalitarian rule. They were responsible for rooting out opposition, suppressing dissent, and ensuring that any form of resistance was swiftly crushed. This created a society where fear and mistrust were pervasive, as people were constantly surveilled and encouraged to report any signs of subversion. Stalin's use of forced labor camps, or gulags, further reinforced the totalitarian system by imprisoning millions for perceived offenses, often without fair trials or evidence. Censorship was another pillar of totalitarianism under Stalin. Newspapers, books, and cultural works were meticulously controlled to eliminate any narratives that contradicted the official state ideology. Historical events were rewritten to glorify Stalin and the Soviet system, with undesirable elements erased from public memory. The suppression of dissent meant that those who opposed the regime or deviated from the official line faced severe consequences, including imprisonment, execution, or exile. Stalin's rule extended into every aspect of personal life. Citizens were not just subjected to political oppression, but were also monitored for signs of ideological deviation. Party loyalty was paramount, and individuals were pressured to demonstrate their commitment to the state through their behavior, thoughts, and affiliations. Families were not immune to the state's scrutiny, as even family members were sometimes forced to report on one another. The totalitarian regime also emphasized collectivism over individualism. The state controlled the economy, effectively abolishing private property and placing collective farms, factories, and industries under central control. This collectivization, while designed to streamline the economy, resulted in widespread suffering, especially in rural areas, where millions were forced to work on state-run farms that were inefficient and underproducing. In summary, Stalin's totalitarian rule was marked by a centralization of power, suppression of dissent, and the creation of a society where the state controlled all aspects of life. Through propaganda, repression, and ideological conformity, Stalin transformed the Soviet Union into a regime where fear and loyalty to the state were paramount, leaving little room for freedom or autonomy. Joseph Stalin's policy of collectivization was one of the most controversial and destructive programs implemented during his reign. Starting in the late 1920s, collectivization was designed to modernize agriculture, increase state control over farming, and consolidate Soviet power in rural areas. Under this policy, individual farms were abolished and merged into large, state-run collective farms, where peasants were forced to work the land collectively. While collectivization was intended to boost agricultural production and eliminate perceived inefficiencies of individual farming, it instead led to widespread hardship, famine, and social disruption. The rationale behind collectivization was rooted in Marxist ideology, which advocated for the abolition of private property and the creation of a fully communist agricultural system. Stalin believed that collective farms would increase efficiency, produce surplus food for industrial workers, and accelerate the transition towards socialism. However, the reality was far from this ideal. At its core, collectivization meant that millions of peasants were forcibly removed from their private farms and herded into large collective units. Land, livestock, tools, and produce were all requisitioned by the state. In many cases, peasants were not given sufficient compensation for their labor, and the state often took far more than was required for industrial purposes or to meet quotas. The state imposed unrealistic production targets, leaving little room for agricultural sustainability or the well-being of the peasant population. The process of collectivization was brutal. Peasants who resisted were labeled as kulaks, wealthier peasants, and were either executed, imprisoned, or sent to labor camps. Millions of families were forcibly relocated to collective farms, where they worked long hours in poor conditions with little access to adequate food, housing, or medical care. There was also a lack of proper agricultural knowledge and tools, which further hindered productivity. Crops often failed, livestock died, and food shortages became widespread. One of the most devastating consequences of collectivization was the famine it caused. Perhaps the most infamous of these was the Holodomor in Ukraine during 1932 to 1933, where millions of Ukrainians died from starvation. The famine was largely a result of forced requisitions of grain, which Stalin ordered to be exported in pursuit of industrial goals. The Soviet government's systematic seizure of food left millions without enough to eat, resulting in one of the deadliest man-made famines in history. In addition to the human suffering, collectivization destroyed rural communities and traditional agricultural systems. Peasants were stripped of their autonomy, livelihoods, and cultural ties to the land. The collectivization process uprooted centuries-old farming practices, disregarded the knowledge of local farmers, and replaced them with rigid, centralized control. The inefficiency of these collective farms meant that agricultural output declined, which only exacerbated the food crisis and deepened the suffering of millions. Despite the overwhelming failure of collectivization to meet its ambitious goals, Stalin and the Soviet leadership continued to enforce the policy. The system persisted throughout the 1930s and beyond, with peasants living in constant fear of the state's brutal enforcement. The collectivization campaign, therefore, became one of the darkest chapters in Soviet history, symbolizing the destructive consequences of forced industrialization and central planning at the expense of human lives and societal well-being. Joseph Stalin's rule saw the rise of a powerful and pervasive cult of personality, where his image was elevated to near deification. Stalin was portrayed as the infallible leader, the father of nations, and the ultimate guide for the Soviet Union's progress towards socialism and prosperity. This cult of personality was meticulously crafted through state propaganda, aimed at solidifying his absolute authority and controlling the narrative of Soviet history and identity. From the earliest stages of his leadership, Stalin utilized propaganda as a tool to reshape the Soviet Union's perception of reality. Under his direction, art, literature, film, and even architecture were carefully controlled to glorify his achievements and ideals. Stalin's image was plastered across posters, billboards, and textbooks, where he was depicted as a strong, wise, and compassionate leader who embodied the spirit of the proletariat and the success of Soviet socialism. One of the defining characteristics of Stalin's cult of personality was the suppression of historical truth. Stalin orchestrated a systematic rewriting of Soviet history to erase dissent and elevate his own role as the sole architect of the Soviet Union's success. Earlier leaders like Lenin were portrayed as having groomed Stalin for leadership, and any opposition to him was cast as an attempt to derail the revolutionary path of socialism. Through the creation of state-sanctioned narratives, Stalin systematically eliminated historical records, works of art, and ideological contributions that did not align with his vision of a monolithic Soviet state. The cult of personality extended beyond visual and written propaganda. Stalin's speeches were carefully scripted to evoke reverence and awe, where he was presented as the fatherly figure guiding the Soviet Union through trials and triumphs. His public appearances were carefully staged to highlight his humility and devotion to the people, while his actions, no matter how brutal, were portrayed as sacrifices made for the greater good of the Soviet state. Schools and educational institutions were central to fostering this cult of personality. Children were taught to idolize Stalin from an early age, with curricula emphasizing loyalty to the party and unquestioning devotion to the leader. Textbooks were rewritten to portray Stalin as a benevolent and visionary leader, erasing any historical or political figures who had opposed him or had fallen from favor. Even holidays and national celebrations were used to cement his image, turning Soviet celebrations into rituals of Stalin worship. The cult of personality reached its peak during the 1930s and 1940s, coinciding with Stalin's consolidation of power and control over every aspect of Soviet society. His image was inescapable, and any deviation from his narrative was considered treasonous. This environment fostered an atmosphere of fear, where individuals were afraid to express independent thought or question the party line for fear of retribution. Dissent was suppressed, and those who opposed or criticized Stalin were subjected to purges, imprisonment, or execution. In sum, Stalin's cult of personality was a central tool for maintaining his absolute control over the Soviet Union. By cultivating an image of infallibility, he established himself as the undisputed leader of the Soviet state, erasing any competing voices and ensuring that Soviet society was shaped by unwavering loyalty to his ideology and vision for the future. Joseph Stalin's foreign policy was driven by his vision of transforming the Soviet Union into a global superpower and ensuring the spread of communist ideology. Under his leadership, the Soviet Union became a central player in the global arena, not only through ideological expansion, but also through military strength and strategic influence. This aggressive approach contributed significantly to the onset of the Cold War, as Stalin sought to extend Soviet dominance across Europe and beyond. Stalin's early foreign policy was heavily influenced by the Soviet Union's role in World War II. The alliance between the USSR, the United States, and the United Kingdom during the war gave way to tensions after the defeat of Nazi Germany. Stalin's vision of a post-war world was centered on a communist bloc that would include Eastern Europe and countries aligned with Soviet influence. This led to the imposition of communist regimes in countries like Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany, creating a Soviet-controlled sphere of influence known as the Eastern Bloc. One of the defining characteristics of Stalin's foreign policy was his distrust of the Western powers. Having experienced betrayal and the Nazi-Soviet pact during World War II, Stalin saw capitalist democracies, particularly the United States and the United Kingdom, as ideological and military rivals. This fueled his desire to expand Soviet influence not only in Europe but across Asia and other regions through communist revolutions or proxies aligned with Soviet interests. Stalin's post-war vision included the establishment of a buffer zone in Eastern Europe to protect the Soviet Union from future invasions. Through a combination of military force, espionage, and political manipulation, Stalin installed loyal communist governments in these countries to serve Soviet interests. This expansion led to the establishment of a rigid Soviet-controlled geopolitical landscape, dividing Europe into two distinct spheres: Western democratic nations aligned with the U.S. and Eastern communist states under Soviet influence. The Cold War began to take shape as tensions between the Soviet Union and Western allies escalated. Stalin's aggressive approach to expanding Soviet power through espionage, support for communist insurgencies, and military buildup placed him in direct opposition to Western democracies. The U.S. adopted a policy of containment, aimed at stopping the spread of communism, which further intensified the rivalry between the two superpowers. Stalin's foreign policy was also marked by a significant military buildup. The Soviet Union developed a powerful military-industrial complex, investing heavily in nuclear weapons, conventional forces, and intelligence networks. The arms race between the U.S. and the USSR became a defining feature of the Cold War, with both sides stockpiling nuclear weapons that threatened global security. Additionally, Stalin was heavily involved in supporting communist movements and guerrilla warfare around the world. Whether through direct military support or through ideological training, the Soviet Union spread its influence into regions like Asia, China, Vietnam, Korea, Latin America, and Africa, seeking to bolster communist revolutionaries aligned with Soviet goals. In summary, Stalin's foreign policy was instrumental in shaping the geopolitical landscape of the Cold War era. His vision of Soviet expansionism, combined with a deep mistrust of Western powers, fueled the ideological, political, and military rivalry that defined the second half of the 20th century. Through aggressive expansion and strategic manipulation, Stalin established the Soviet Union as a dominant force in global politics, setting the stage for a prolonged struggle for dominance between two competing ideologies, capitalism and communism. Joseph Stalin's rule left an indelible mark on Soviet society, fundamentally transforming the way people lived, worked, and interacted with the state. His policies, ranging from industrialization and collectivization to purges and propaganda, altered every aspect of daily life, creating a system of extreme control, fear, and conformity. The impact of Stalin's rule extended beyond the immediate victims of political repression and economic hardship, shaping the Soviet Union's culture, social dynamics, and collective memory for decades. One of the most profound ways Stalin's rule affected Soviet society was through the dismantling of individual freedoms. The totalitarian regime ensured that every citizen's life was monitored by the state. From the moment individuals woke up in the morning to the time they went to bed, the state controlled what they could say, what they could do, and how they interacted with others. Schools and workplaces were heavily politicized, and citizens were expected to display unwavering loyalty to the Communist Party and its leader. Personal relationships were affected, as family members were encouraged or coerced to inform on one another in fear of anti-Soviet activities. This created a pervasive atmosphere of mistrust and paranoia, where any dissent could result in arrest or execution. The social fabric of Soviet society was altered by the state's emphasis on collectivism and state-led development. Individual accomplishments were devalued in favor of collective achievements. Workplaces, farms, and communities were organized into hierarchical structures with little room for personal agency. People were forced to contribute to the state's production goals, whether through manual labor on collective farms or as part of industrial projects aimed at meeting Stalin's ambitious quotas. As a result, workers often experienced extreme levels of exhaustion and dehumanization, with little regard for personal well-being or safety. Stalin's policies also led to the destruction of much of Russia's cultural heritage. Intellectuals, artists, and scientists who failed to align with state-approved narratives were purged or silenced. Books, art, and music were censored or rewritten to serve state propaganda. This censorship stifled creative expression and cultural innovation, resulting in a society where conformity to the state's ideology took precedence over individual thought and artistic freedom. The loss of talent and knowledge was immense, as many intellectuals and artists either fled abroad or were eliminated during purges, depriving Soviet society of its cultural diversity. The economic hardships of the time also had lasting impacts on society. The forced collectivization and rapid industrialization created a situation where entire communities were uprooted and subjected to brutal working conditions. Famines like the Holodomor in Ukraine and the general inefficiency of collective agriculture led to immense suffering. Families lost their livelihoods and saw loved ones perish due to starvation, disease, and forced labor. The economic strain caused by unrealistic quotas and state requisitions further exacerbated social inequality, as peasants and workers were treated as mere tools for the state's grand industrial projects. Stalin's rule also altered the collective memory of Soviet citizens. The narrative imposed by the state rewrote history to glorify Stalin as the architect of Soviet greatness. Any mention of dissent, mistakes, or atrocities was erased from public discourse. The generation that lived through Stalin's rule was taught to revere the leader and accept the sacrifices made for the state's so-called progress. This distorted portrayal shaped how Soviet history was taught, creating a false sense of unity and success that masked the profound pain and suffering experienced by many individuals. In summary, Stalin's rule had a lasting impact on Soviet society. The regime reshaped social, cultural, and economic life through repression, collectivization, and extreme control, leaving behind a legacy of fear, suffering, and conformity. The state's relentless pursuit of power and ideology disrupted every aspect of individual existence, creating a society marked by suppression, mistrust, and an overwhelming emphasis on state-driven goals over personal well-being and freedom. Joseph Stalin's rule saw the transformation of the Soviet Union into a formidable military power, a crucial development that played a pivotal role in shaping the outcome of World War II. Stalin's policies during the interwar years, combined with rapid industrialization and a focus on military expansion, prepared the Soviet Union to face the challenges of the conflict. The Soviet military played a decisive role in defeating Nazi Germany and contributed significantly to the eventual Allied victory. From the outset of his leadership, Stalin prioritized the modernization of the Soviet military. Under the leadership of figures like Marshal Georgy Zhukov and other prominent military figures, the Soviet Union rapidly developed its armed forces in response to the growing threat of fascist expansionism in Europe. The buildup of the Red Army was one of the most extensive in the world, with resources diverted from other sectors to enhance military capabilities. This effort included the development of heavy tanks, aircraft, artillery, and an extensive system of logistics to support the vast front lines of war. One of the key challenges Stalin faced was the purges of the late 1930s, which eliminated many experienced military leaders. During this period, thousands of high-ranking officers and military experts were arrested or executed in the Stalinist purges, leaving the Soviet Union temporarily vulnerable. However, despite the loss of skilled personnel, Stalin's regime quickly re-established a new leadership structure, rebuilding a capable military command capable of responding to the German invasion. When Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, the Soviet Union found itself unprepared for the scale of the attack. The initial months of the invasion were disastrous for the Red Army, with significant territorial losses and high casualties. Soviet forces suffered through brutal battles and overwhelming logistical challenges, with cities like Kiev, Smolensk, and Moscow coming under German control. However, despite these setbacks, Stalin demonstrated remarkable resilience and leadership, rallying the nation to resist the invaders. Stalin's leadership became increasingly central as the Soviet war effort progressed. His ability to motivate the Soviet people through speeches, propaganda, and total war mobilization played a crucial role in sustaining the home front. He promoted an image of unity, portraying the struggle against Nazi Germany as a fight not only for the survival of the Soviet state, but for the future of communism itself. The role of the Communist Party in managing the war effort solidified the state's grip over civilian and military affairs, ensuring that every aspect of society supported the war effort. The Soviet military's turning point came during the battles of Stalingrad and Kursk. These pivotal engagements proved to be decisive in halting the German advance and initiating the Soviet counteroffensive. The Battle of Stalingrad was one of the bloodiest battles in human history, with fierce urban warfare that resulted in heavy losses on both sides. However, the Soviet Union's ability to recover and sustain its forces through vast networks of supply and relentless reinforcements demonstrated the resilience of the Red Army and the Soviet leadership under Stalin. In the later stages of the war, the Soviet Union played a critical role in the liberation of Eastern Europe, Berlin, and eventually the defeat of Nazi Germany in May 1945. The Red Army's immense manpower and industrial output proved instrumental in overwhelming German forces on the Eastern Front, effectively determining the course of the conflict. Stalin's focus on maintaining military discipline, pushing for territorial gains, and ensuring Soviet dominance over occupied territories ensured that the Soviet Union emerged as a superpower, both politically and militarily, on the global stage. In conclusion, Stalin's leadership and the Soviet Union's military strength were fundamental to the Allied victory in World War II. The Red Army's resilience, innovation, and sheer determination, guided by Stalin's vision and control, allowed the Soviet Union to turn the tide of war and establish itself as a dominant force in the post-war world order. Joseph Stalin's reign was marked by widespread purges and repression, during which millions of Soviet citizens were arrested, executed, or sent to forced labor camps. The purges were a means for Stalin to consolidate power, eliminate perceived threats, and enforce absolute loyalty to the Communist Party. These campaigns of terror had devastating consequences for Soviet society, creating a culture of fear, mistrust, and suppression that defined the Soviet Union for decades. The Great Purge, which took place between 1936 and 1938, was the most notorious period of mass repression. During this time, Stalin launched a campaign against perceived enemies of the state, including political rivals, former Bolsheviks, intellectuals, military officers, and even ordinary citizens. The purge extended beyond political opposition, targeting anyone who was seen as a potential threat to Stalin's authority or the stability of the Soviet regime. Stalin justified the purges as necessary to safeguard the Soviet Union from internal enemies, counter-revolutionaries, and foreign conspiracies. The use of propaganda was pervasive, with the state-controlled media painting a picture of a nation under constant siege from spies, saboteurs, and traitors. The fearmongering created an atmosphere where people were encouraged to report on one another, and dissenters were systematically eliminated. The purges were not confined to political opponents alone. Intellectuals, writers, scientists, and even artists who did not conform to the state's rigid ideology were persecuted. Prominent figures like poets Osip Mandelstam and writers Maxim Gorky were harassed or executed for ideological deviation. The destruction of intellectual and cultural freedom led to a significant loss of creativity and innovation. as critical thinking and artistic expression were suppressed in favor of propaganda that glorified Stalin's leadership. The Soviet military was also deeply affected by the purges. The Purge of the Red Army, known as the military purge, resulted in the elimination of thousands of senior officers, including generals, commanders, and military strategists. This weakened the Soviet military's ability to defend the country when Nazi Germany invaded in 1941. Despite this initial setback, Stalin was able to quickly rebuild the military leadership, but the purges had long-term consequences for the Soviet armed forces. The process of repression extended beyond executions. The secret police, primarily the NKVD, conducted mass arrests, torture, and show trials where individuals were forced to confess to crimes they often did not commit. These trials were public spectacles designed to intimidate the population and showcase Stalin's control. Many victims were accused of crimes such as espionage, sabotage, or being part of fabricated Trotsky conspiracies. Millions of people were sent to the gulag system, forced labor camps, where they faced inhumane conditions, forced labor, and starvation. The camps became a central part of the Soviet repression machine, with political prisoners working in mines, construction projects, and military installations under grueling conditions. The gulags became a symbol of Stalin's brutal rule and a reminder of the lengths to which the state would go to eliminate opposition. One of the most tragic aspects of the purges was the destruction of entire families. Often, entire families were targeted for perceived crimes or associations with dissent. Children and relatives of accused individuals were subjected to surveillance and persecution, ensuring that loyalty to the state was enforced at every level. The psychological toll on Soviet citizens was immense, as no one could trust their neighbors, friends, or even family members. In summary, the purges and repression under Stalin's rule were a means of solidifying his control over the Soviet Union by systematically eliminating dissent and enforcing a climate of fear. The brutal methods used to maintain power destroyed countless lives and left an enduring legacy of trauma, mistrust, and loss that deeply affected Soviet society for decades. Joseph Stalin's leadership is closely associated with the rapid industrialization of the Soviet Union, a policy aimed at transforming the agrarian economy into a modern, industrial superpower. The concept of socialism in one country necessitated that the Soviet Union become self-reliant, capable of sustaining its own industrial and military capabilities without dependence on capitalist nations. This ambitious vision led to a series of 5-year plans that reshaped the Soviet economy, though the cost was immense in terms of human suffering, inefficiency, and environmental damage. Stalin's industrialization efforts began in earnest with the first 5-year plan, launched in 1928. The goal was to build a strong industrial base capable of supporting heavy industries such as steel production, coal mining, machinery, and energy generation. The state prioritized the development of heavy industry over consumer goods or agriculture, which meant that workers were pushed to produce at breakneck speeds to meet unrealistic quotas set by the government. This approach ignored the limitations of Soviet resources and the reality of economic infrastructure. The Soviet leadership under Stalin invested heavily in large-scale projects like the construction of factories, power plants, and transportation networks. Cities were built practically overnight to house workers needed for the massive industrial output. Magnitogorsk and Stalingrad, for example, were transformed into industrial hubs from virtually nothing. Similarly, the creation of the Soviet automobile industry, represented by factories such as GAZ and UAZ, was central to the state's push for self-sufficiency in production. However, this rapid industrialization came with significant social and economic costs. The brutal enforcement of production targets created a system of forced labor and harsh discipline. Workers were penalized for failing to meet their quotas, resulting in excessive working hours, unsafe working conditions, and little regard for personal well-being. Strikes and protests were met with repression, and any form of resistance was quickly suppressed by the state. The focus on quantity over quality led to widespread inefficiencies. Factories were often incapable of producing goods that met basic standards due to rushed construction and lack of skilled labor. Resources were diverted to heavy industry, while the needs of the agricultural sector were neglected, exacerbating shortages of consumer goods. Workers, including those in rural areas, were constantly forced to meet unrealistic quotas, leading to reduced productivity and increased discontent. The collectivization of agriculture, which accompanied industrialization, was particularly harmful. Stalin's policies created a strain on rural areas, where food production was insufficient to meet the demands of industrial workers and the state. Forced requisitions of grain and other agricultural products caused widespread famines and forced millions of peasants into desperate poverty. This imbalance between industrialization and agricultural production intensified the suffering of the rural population, fueling resentment against the Soviet regime. Despite these drawbacks, Stalin's industrialization efforts did achieve some long-term successes. By the late 1930s, the Soviet Union had emerged as a significant industrial power, with advancements in heavy machinery, infrastructure, and energy production. Factories and steel mills were producing goods on a scale never before seen in Soviet history. This industrial capacity allowed the Soviet Union to sustain its military needs during World War II and outproduce Nazi Germany in key wartime materials such as tanks, aircraft, and weapons. Additionally, the industrialization process created a highly centralized and militarized economy. The Soviet state wielded absolute control over production, with little regard for free market principles. The economic planning system became deeply entrenched, and the state assumed full responsibility for allocating resources and controlling industrial output. This approach, however, stifled innovation and technological development, as creativity and efficiency were subordinated to political demands. In summary, Stalin's industrialization policies transformed the Soviet Union into a major industrial power, but at an enormous human and economic cost. While the rapid development of heavy industry laid the groundwork for Soviet military strength and self-sufficiency, the inefficiencies, exploitation of labor, and neglect of agricultural needs caused widespread suffering and hardship. The industrialization drive, though successful in certain aspects, demonstrated the dangers of prioritizing political objectives over sustainable economic development. Joseph Stalin's reign left a lasting impact on Soviet history and the broader world. His leadership transformed the Soviet Union into a global superpower, but at the cost of widespread suffering, repression, and a distorted legacy. His policies, including industrialization, purges, collectivization, and military expansion, left a complex and often contradictory legacy that shaped the Soviet Union for decades and continues to be debated today. Stalin's legacy is one of immense contradictions. On the one hand, he played a crucial role in industrializing the Soviet Union, defeating Nazi Germany, and establishing the Soviet Union as a military and ideological superpower. His policies led to the rise of the Soviet Union as a global leader in both nuclear weapons and space exploration. The Soviet space program, which achieved milestones like the launch of Sputnik and Yuri Gagarin's historic spaceflight, was a testament to the success of the industrial and scientific advancements initiated under his leadership. However, the methods used to achieve these successes came at a heavy cost. Stalin's reign was marked by mass repression, the destruction of intellectual freedom, forced labor, and the persecution of millions of innocent people. The purges, forced collectivization, and ruthless political control created a society of fear, where personal freedoms were suppressed and dissent was punished with severe brutality. The gulag system alone incarcerated millions, and the toll on human life, creativity, and cultural development was immense. Stalin's cult of personality also ensured that historical memory was heavily curated and manipulated. His portrayal as the father of nations and the architect of Soviet greatness resulted in the suppression of dissenting narratives. History was rewritten to emphasize his leadership as infallible, and any acknowledgement of his crimes was met with state repression. This distorted legacy created a generation of Soviet citizens who grew up with a sanitized version of history that glossed over the horrors of Stalin's rule. The Soviet Union's post-Stalin era saw the gradual de-Stalinization under leaders like Nikita Khrushchev, who exposed some of the crimes and excesses of Stalin's reign during the 1956 secret speech. However, even after Stalin's death in 1953, the lingering effects of his policies continued to influence Soviet society. The system of centralized control and fear persisted, and it took decades for the Soviet Union to fully emerge from the shadow of Stalinism. Stalin's legacy also affected the global perception of the Soviet Union. His rule shaped how the West viewed the USSR during the Cold War era. The brutal suppression of dissidents, espionage, and authoritarian control were central concerns for the international community, which saw the Soviet Union as a symbol of totalitarianism. This perception influenced diplomatic relations, military alliances, and ideological rivalries throughout the 20th century. In contemporary Russia and former Soviet states, Stalin's legacy remains a subject of heated debate. While some view him as a strong leader who restored Russia's status as a great power, others remember the pain and suffering caused by his authoritarianism. In recent years, there has been an ongoing reassessment of Stalin's role in history, with varying degrees of rehabilitation and condemnation across different regions. In conclusion, Joseph Stalin's legacy is multifaceted and deeply entrenched in both Soviet and world history. His rule reshaped the Soviet Union into a formidable power, but at the cost of immense human suffering and the suppression of freedom. The long-lasting impact of his policies continues to influence political, social, and historical discourse, highlighting the complexities of his role in shaping the 20th century. Joseph Stalin's leadership had a profound impact on global politics during and after World War II, shaping the post-war world order and influencing the Cold War era. His vision for a powerful Soviet Union sought to expand Soviet influence beyond its borders, while his actions contributed to the ideological and geopolitical divisions that defined the 20th century. At the end of World War II, Stalin emerged as one of the most powerful figures in the world, alongside leaders like Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt. The Soviet Union had played a critical role in defeating Nazi Germany, and Stalin sought to expand Soviet influence over Eastern Europe and establish a buffer zone of communist-leaning states in Central and Eastern Europe. This strategy created a divide between Soviet and Western powers, leading to the formation of two opposing blocs: the Western democratic nations and the Communist Eastern Bloc. One of Stalin's most significant influences on global politics was the establishment of Soviet satellite states. Countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria became part of the Soviet sphere of influence, with communist regimes supported by the Soviet Union installed through both diplomatic pressure and, in some cases, military intervention. This expansion of Soviet control created tensions with Western democracies, which feared the spread of Soviet ideology and the loss of influence in Eastern Europe. The Berlin Wall, erected in 1961, became a stark symbol of this ideological divide, dividing East and West Berlin as a physical manifestation of the Cold War conflict. Stalin's role in shaping the communist ideology globally also extended to influencing revolutionary movements across the world. He provided support and resources to communist parties in countries like China, Vietnam, and Cuba, advocating for the spread of Marxist-Leninist principles. His influence over global communist movements helped solidify Soviet control over the international communist movement, though tensions occasionally arose between Moscow and nationalist communist leaders, such as Mao Zedong in China. Additionally, Stalin's policies of expansionism led to increased tensions with the United States and other Western powers during the early stages of the Cold War. His demand for the maintenance of Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe and the imposition of strict communist rule created suspicion among Western leaders. The Truman Doctrine, which sought to contain Soviet influence, emerged in response to Stalin's aggressive post-war policies. This policy led to the establishment of alliances like NATO and the Warsaw Pact, marking the beginning of a militarized and ideological rivalry between the Soviet Union and Western nations. Stalin's legacy in global politics also included his involvement in key Cold War crises. His leadership during the Korean War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and other proxy wars saw the Soviet Union deeply entrenched in regional conflicts around the globe. Through diplomacy, espionage, and military support, the Soviet Union sought to challenge Western powers and assert its dominance in key regions, creating a bipolar world order that defined the political landscape for decades. However, Stalin's influence began to wane after his death in 1953, as the Soviet Union faced internal struggles and criticism of his authoritarian policies. His successors, most notably Nikita Khrushchev, sought to de-escalate tensions with the West and move toward a more moderate form of governance. Despite this shift, Stalin's impact on global politics left an indelible mark, with the division between communist and capitalist blocs shaping much of the 20th century's geopolitical landscape. In summary, Stalin's influence on global politics was profound, extending far beyond the Soviet Union's borders. His vision for a powerful communist state contributed to the ideological and geopolitical divides of the Cold War era, leaving a legacy that shaped international relations for decades. Whether seen as a visionary leader or a tyrant who caused immense suffering, his role in shaping global political dynamics remains a crucial element of 20th century history.